Okay. David's going to be covering an interesting topic titled An Aesthetic Ethic. David gave his dissertation last year on the subject at Zhongda University. Now, aesthetics and ethics are both very hard and maybe the most difficult questions to answer in philosophy. Aesthetics dealing with ideas of beauty, and ethics dealing with what is right and wrong or good and bad. Ethics is one of the hottest subjects in science and philosophy these days. So let's see how David can help us to answer some of these very hard questions.
Okay. Shall I sit while I'm doing
No. Stand up, sit, and do what you want.
All right. Because we've just had a little change in our presentation here. My PowerPoint is being shown on the computer below us, so just for the audience here, I'm hoping can read it. And Ethan just gave a pretty good introduction. The idea, he focused on aesthetics and ethics. It's not that I'm really doing a philosophical analysis of them proper. What I do is I link these two ideas to history, historical narrative. That's my key as when I studied literature. And I found that these two ideas are really good open doors to understanding history and historical narrative and historical consciousness and how we frame our histories. And so I've tried to create a model that can link these two ideas to this idea of historical narrative, fictional and non-fictional. That's another key point that I'll get to. So to begin, I'll just move forward here. Here's some sort of definition to start us off. I often start my analyses with etymologies, and we find that the word aesthetic means to perceive. And so that idea of how we see history, how we perceive it as we experience it, becomes important. And ethic, as you might guess, is words like character and comrade, kinship and family. And so that community intersubjectivity is an important idea that I link in throughout my analysis. My analysis, I've sort of boiled it down here to three aims. One, just the idea of aesthetic experience and aesthetics within lived experience, within and as experience. And I think that's an important idea that we will find that this is an idea borrowed from John Dewey, that aesthetics is central to our perception and our understanding of ourselves. Then again, the important idea of community dynamics, intersubjectivity, and morality within lived experience, and how those, you'll be surprised how much of a focus that history gives on that idea. And finally, at the very end, I'll introduce just a small handful of aesthetic factors that are employed in narrative and the way those sort of feed into the narrative and back out into the told history. And I have a definition here from one writer. He says that historical narrative is a discourse founded on genre conventions, which is aesthetics, and the expectations and beliefs of the community, and that's the ethic, and that's how they link together. At the very bottom here, I have sort of what could be called my thesis, and I write that the transaction of human awareness and narrative, steeped in intersubjectivity and phenomenological intentionality, with an aesthetic thrust emerging from human consciousness and experience, and entering into the communicative endeavors of historiography, the nonfiction, and historical fiction. Note the word transaction there. That also is from John Dewey, and he talked in his book Knowing and the Known how we know and when we know and what we know, how those two things are really become one and the same, and how they connect together, and that process is aesthetic to the core. Now again, sort of this is my model, and again what I hope it is. I hope it's a pragmatic model. One thing that you find is a lot of historical analysts in the past, some of them are just too pragmatic. To them, history is history. It's just the stuff that happened. Just what happened and nothing else, right? And there are historians that really argue that point very strongly. They really object to any idea of anything other than what happened, the sequence of events being introduced to history. That's the ultra pragmatist. On the other side, people that are too theoretical, and in this study, believe me, it goes way, way theoretical. It really does. I've tried to come to the middle of that, and I'm hoping that what I'll show you is pragmatic. It's realistic. There's a lot of theory involved, but I don't want it to turn into just a study of theory. I think it's a sociolinguistic analysis, right? The sociology and the community and intersubjectivity, the linguistics and the aesthetics of that, and how those come together in the text that I look at. I think it's a dialectic. It's an active dialectic that will allow us to evaluate historical consciousness and narrative in really what I think, as I said, will open new doors to this understanding. And finally, I turn to Husserl. It's really a very time-conscious expanse that we look at from past to present to future. And that kind of links across, again, the fictional and the non-fictional narratives, what's imagined and what's experienced. They both have important roles to play. I call it, again, a transactive threshold, where historical experience and narrative meet and blend. Okay, but I will warn you, turning to Nelson Goodman here, our quarry sometimes will not be what we expect. And as he says, sometimes we'll be chasing a coon up a tree and there'll be no coon there. And other times we're chasing something and we'll find that it's not a coon at all. And he says that we really traverse some cruel country in this kind of study. It does. It gets a little weird at times. It gets difficult. But as he says at the end, let's focus on what we learn, not just our kill in the end, all right? So brace yourselves. It can be difficult, but it's a fascinating study when you really begin to really ponder what does your history mean, right? How do you tell it yourself? And then the way others tell it, and how we realize the importance of that in our lives, right? That's memory and saved experience. And so that's why this is so valuable to me, that we find that history is not something that we should brush off at all. It's really something we need to investigate deeply so we understand it. Now I'll turn to some theory. I call it, this is the social moral ethics. Some great theorists, Jürgen Straub, Hayden White, and Hans Robert Jauss, major theorists, world-famous people. And you'll find that in these quotes, they are always saying how history is ethical and moral, right, and aesthetic, right? And they constantly link those together. Straub wrote that narratives are socio-culturally mediated, right? They are connected to cultural and social background all the time. They are connected to an intersubjective situation. So the importance of that, again, it's not just what happened. You have to bring in the living eventness of what's happening to really understand what's going on. Hayden White's one of the most famous theorists. I actually talked to him when I was writing the dissertation. He's worshipped in this area. And he writes that if every story points to a moral, every historical narrative, or endows events, whether real or imaginary, they're both acceptable, with a significance that they did not possess as mere sequence, right? They're more than that. They're more than just events that happened. Every historical narration has as its intent or manifest purpose the desire to moralize. So again, we've got to look beyond just what happened. And finally, Jauss, he's a very good writer, has lots of interesting things to say. The relationship between literature and reader can actualize itself in the sensorial realm as an incitement to aesthetic perception, right? So when we're reading historical literatures, they incite our aesthetic perception. That's vital to our existence. As well as in the ethical realm, he turns right to that, as a summons to moral reflection. So again, you see how they're working together. Aesthetics and morality are not separate events. They're very much connected. Now I've got some examples from historical writing here for you. And I'll read these since I'm sure you can't see them, showing, again, the vital essence of community in historical writing. Erich Maria Remarque, All Quiet on the Western Front. He was writing about Paul Barmer, the protagonist of the novel. He had jumped into a foxhole, and then another man had jumped in after him, and the bullets were firing, and he was hating this man for revealing his position and thinking he wanted to kill him and stuff dirt into his mouth. But then gradually he saw the humanity of it, and he changed, and he began to plead with the man, no, I want to help you, comrade. This dead man, the man slowly died in the hole. He's bound up with my life. Therefore I must do everything, promise everything in order to save myself. I swear blindly that I mean to live only for his sake and for his family. So again, that vital moral thrust in history, all right? John Keegan is a historian, so he's writing nonfiction about World War I, and he wrote a very similar thing. Comradeship flourished in the networked cities of the Western and Eastern fronts in the trenches. Bound strangers into the closest brotherhood, elevated the loyalties created within the ethos of temporary regimentality to the status of life and death blood ties. So Keegan's writing nonfiction and he's writing fiction, but they're writing the same thing. They have that same aim. And James McPherson, very famous writer of the Civil War in the United States, similar idea. Joshua L. Chamberlain, Union colonel, gave a brief order and a bugle call sang out. This is during the surrender of the Confederacy. Instantly, the Union soldiers shifted from order arms to carry arms, the salute of honor. Hearing the sound, Confederate General Gordon looked up in surprise and with sudden realization turned smartly to Chamberlain, dipped his sword in salute, and ordered his own men to carry arms. These enemies in many a bloody battle ended the war not with shame on one side and exultation on the other, but with a soldier's mutual salutation and farewell. So again, just McPherson, it was very important to him to highlight that, right? To go beyond just saying, right, they two met and one surrendered and then it was over. He had to go beyond that. So that's vital to understanding our history, and I try to emphasize that in this study. Again, here I turn to a similar idea of morality in historical writing. William Styron, who wrote the great historical novel, The Confessions of Nat Turner. And he's writing here about a slave owner who's pondering his own slave ownership and his brethren slave owners, and he's denouncing them. He says, how else can we account for such faltering, clumsy, hateful cruelty in ourselves? Even the possums and the skunks know better. Even the weasels and the meadow mice have a natural regard for their own blood. Yes, it could be that mankind has yet to be born. Then, turning again to, at the same time, the same period of nonfiction, Charles Ball was a slave who gained his freedom and then wrote a book about his experience, and he had said the same thing. The entire white population is leagued together by a common bond of the most sordid interest in the torture and oppression of the poor descendants of Africa. And finally, Richard Hofstadter, another historian, he was writing, commenting on how the founding fathers in the United States, we usually really venerate them as these great thinkers, these great humane thinkers, but he points out that in fact they weren't. If you look at their theory, it's often rather inhumane, and it's really just pitting, one side against the other, and to see who can come out, better. And he points that out here. Says that any modern thinkers that want to find some sort of elevated philosophy in the founding fathers, they're not going to find it there. Next, I turn to another theorist and historical writer, Daniel Wickberg. He's a scholar in the United States, and he has a theory what he calls the histories of sensibilities. And he says, again, got to get beyond just relating the sequence of events. We've got to go beneath that. And he says that what we really need to study for history is the modes of perception and feeling, the terms and forms in which objects were conceived, experienced, and represented in the past, as well as the ideas, emotions, beliefs, and values. So even talking about representation here, that becomes an aesthetic factor, but at the same time he says we need to connect that to our moral and ethical consciousness. This is a concept that lets us dig beneath the social actions and apparent content of sources to the ground upon which these sources emerge. The emotional, intellectual, aesthetic, there he even includes that, and moral dispositions of those who lived their history. All right? So I found that Wickberg's Histories of Sensibilities, and he's published on this, was really kind of confirmed the aesthetics ethic, right? That really was the history that needed to be told. And then I turned to two historians here, the great Perry Miller and Paul Cohen, who wrote about China, and both of them comment how my goal was to, inspect the sensibility of these people, and my goal was to inspect the feelings and thoughts of the participants in history. So we find that Wickberg was really onto something, and even major historians are doing that. So again, I think that by turning to this, we will learn more about our histories. And then toward the end here, I said I would give you a small handful of aesthetic factors. And this is just a small bit. This is a whole chapter in my dissertation. And I just give you a few points here, and it's interesting how these aesthetics relate back to those morals and ethics. One thing is within narrative, and it's always narrative, we have something called modal knowledge, or what I call modality. And that's the what ifs. That's the counterfactual histories. What could have been true? Now again, many historians will say that's not what we write about. We don't write about what could have happened. We only write about what did happen. But actually you'll find again and again when you read histories, whether fictional or non-fictional, in fact, they're always writing about what could have happened. That balance, that comparison between what could and what did is necessary to understand everything. So that's like central to narrative, and thus central to my study. And then this is an important idea. David Carr said, because of the closeness of structure between human action and narrative, we can genuinely say that narrative authentically expresses truth, right? It's not just an aesthetic deal. It's not just, dabbling with words. Because I'm a big believer in narrative consciousness. And because this is narrative, when we transfer that to written narrative, there's a link there that expresses an absolute truth that is really fascinating to see. So again, that's narrative at work. The explanatory power of narrative. David Lodge, another theorist, wrote about a perceptual pattern or structure in narrative. It's not just words on the page, it's not just paragraphs, it's a perceptual pattern. And it possesses qualities that the whole is more than just the sum of its parts. And then this is an idea that a lot of writers have talked about, vertical and horizontal sectors in narrative. And Truman Capote, who wrote one of the great historical books, In Cold Blood, he talked how you'll be writing horizontally, right? You're kind of going through the events, the sequence of actions, then you'll go vertical. You'll become God. And then you're looking down with a moral aim down at those events. And those things then connect, they transact at that point. And again, that's like just an important facet of narrative. And then finally, I studied the idea of selection. Any narrative process is always a selective process, choosing what you want to convey, organizing it in the way that you want. And that idea, again, connected to our aesthetic perception, is really both intellectual and cognizant, because you're always having to think these things through, but it's also emotional, sensible, right? Because you're always moved to select something for your choice to tell your story. So these aesthetic qualities, I think, continually connect back to the moral and ethical, and that's the fact of the transaction that's going on. So, to conclude, what I hope I've shown you is a lot more than Vias Eigenlichkeiten, all right? History as it happened, just what happened, if you speak German. I think that, I hope that it's more than that, and I'm hoping that it's more interesting than that. I'm hoping that, again, as Wickberg said, we've observed the veritable ground of fictional and non-fictional historical narrative and experience. It's a contested zone. It's not always easy to kind of fight your way through this. But it's the zone out of which in which history happens and out of which history is narrated. This is going back to just a central idea, the individual and community historical experience, awareness, and discourse, narrative, with all of their embedded obligations, interfaces, and aesthetic dependencies. The transaction of the aesthetic and the moral ethical. And as a final point here, I turn to another great writer, Wolfgang Iser, very theoretical. So he tends to go way high, but it's fascinating the way he sees it. And if you really look at these words, again, they seem to say that there's an aesthetics ethic that's shaping history. He writes that, what I'll say, the aesthetic ethics enables the reader to combine segments into a field by reciprocal modification. This is the reader reading the narrative. To form positions from those fields and then to adapt each position to its successor and predecessor. That's the time consciousness, from past to present to future. In a process that ultimately transforms the textual perspectives through a whole range of alternating themes and background relationships into the aesthetic object of the text. Again, that's high theoretical talk there, but it's surprising to me it captures, I think, everything that's been said so far. And so that's really, I believe, my conclusion. I'm just hoping that by examining these aesthetic and ethical details, in more detail. It really will open our eyes to what we've lived and what we've experienced and how that's written. And that's sort of, what I was after, because as a literature student, I wanted to look at what was written and how it was written. And I think that this shows it. It's much deeper than just words on the page. Okay? Thanks for listening. I have one last quote here at the bottom you can catch up to that just talks about the idea of nonfiction and fictional histories, which is really the central aim of my whole dissertation, how they're not enemies at all, the way some historians claim. Actually, they're brethren. They're inseparable twins, as he says here. All right? On the next page, if you're interested, I have a bibliography if anyone wants to look anything up. And you know what? I forgot to give you something while we were talking. I have here a sort of a sketch of my aesthetics ethic, and it kind of covers everything we've talked about and also a little more because it goes deeper into my dissertation. And what I really try, if you look at this, I'm really trying to show the transaction at work, okay? We start from individual and community lived experience. That's the first history, okay? And that's actually a separate area, and many historians will say that's history. Okay? And they'll tell you, don't call narrative history, because they're not the same. Now, I don't fully agree with that idea, but you can consider it. Here I have separated them. On the one hand, history is just history. On the other side, we have fictional and non-fictional narratives. And then those two things are linked up, transacted with these things I've sketched out here. Plot, character, and becoming, those are aesthetic factors. Modality, predication, subjunctive, incident, those are aesthetic factors. And yet they're not just aesthetic, they're also moral, ethical. Ideology, rhetoric, morality, that's morals and ethics. Performance, communication, and imagination, that becomes sort of like experience itself. And all of those things come out, as I said, history is lived there, and then narrative comes out of that, and that's what I call actualization and composition at the bottom, right? And so you see, looking at this, that you see what I hope that this sketch shows is this fascinating connection between our narrative history and our narrative histories, and all the interesting factors that link across them. So I meant to hand that to you earlier, but you can see it now. And so thanks again, everybody, for hearing me out.
Thank you, David.